Good afternoon, and welcome to this Indigenous learning event entitled Indigenous Inclusion and Wellbeing in the Federal Public Service. Thank you for joining us today. Je m'appelle Lorenzo Ieraci et je suis le sous-ministre adjoint de la Direction générale des politiques, de la planification et des communications à Services publics et approvisionnement Canada. Je serai votre modérateur de séance aujourd'hui et je suis très heureux d'appuyer l'École de la fonction publique du Canada en animant cet événement. Let me start by acknowledging that the land from which I am talking to you is located in Ottawa, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I acknowledge and give thanks for the land on which we live and work, and to the people who have cared for it. Certains d'entre vous nous rejoignent aujourd'hui de différentes régions du pays, et je vous encourage donc à prendre un moment pour reconnaître et souligner le territoire que vous occupez. I would also like to mention that some of the topics discussed in the panel today may evoke an emotional response. These discussions are not intended to hurt or to harm, but rather are intended to provide context and to raise awareness about the importance of cultural competency. It is now my pleasure to introduce Elder Verna McGregor. Elder Verna is from the Algonquin community of Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe. She is firmly grounded in her community and nation as a member of the group of traditional grandmothers, or Kokomisag, and elders. Their role includes promoting the retention of the Algonquin language and culture, which is so important when addressing community issues and connections to the land. I would now like to turn to Elder Verna.
Oh, miigwech, thank you, merci. Hello, everybody. Kwe kakina, bonjour tout le monde. Tout à tous, je veux dire. Thank you for acknowledging our traditional lands, and I'm very honored to be here today to talk about Indigenous retention, inclusion, and well-being, which I think is important because just really quickly too, I did start off my career. I have a varied career in the public service, and this is many moons ago in the late 80s. And because of also issues in the workplace, I didn't stay in the public service very long. I ended up leaving. I only stayed for maybe a year. And back then, too, as well, there wasn't the policy that they had today in terms of addressing racism and in the workplace. So what I did was I left the public service, but I did come back intermittently throughout the years. And here I am talking to the School of Public Service, so I'm very honored to do that. Why is inclusion so important from my thinking, too? I was just talking before coming here, even the importance of the language. I have been working on the language recently, even in translation. And for us as Algonquin, we're known as Domamaninuag. But I just mentioned an important observation beforehand. Even the word water, for us, we have 3 pages full of a description in our lexicon describing water. And because the languages are very expressive and they carry a lot of knowledge, and today they would call that traditional knowledge. So today, too, we're dealing with climate change. We're dealing with species extinction. So now there's also now a great interest in traditional knowledge, and people, and it was foretold by our ancestors that there would be a seeking of knowledge in the times we're in. So here we are today too as well. So I think too, from my perspective, I think that's why Indigenous retention, inclusion, and well-being is so important. And I think too as well, I think the public service too has also benefited from bringing in also and becoming aware of the culture and knowledge too. So I think we're on a journey together. Going back to part of my background has been in banking, and going back to the bank, one of their mottos is if we have an issue, we want to hear about it. Why did they do that? Is they wanted to hear about complaints because the average person, 95% of the population, instead of voicing their concern, they go away. It's only 5% back then that actually raised an issue or concern. And so for the bank, that translates into lost customers. But today, too, we're talking about retention. So dealing with the issue of retention, inclusion, and well-being also is important today, especially too, we're one of the lowest in terms of representation in the public service. So on that note, I'm honored to say an opening miigwech on je nigashkitocha mawando se konshe non go mame kakina pamad sajik shwen mishnon in abigus. We dokwa kakina pamazich konje nagadawabdan kakina guch ninda kimenan shkaki kwezin kazo ninda kimenan we dokwa kakina we wachonje kakina ete kijigo kizis to be kizis a shajanangshak we dokwa nanokumis nan onje nagadawabdan kakina guch nibi a shajnibishomsin on kizis onje nagadawabdan kakina guch ya Pimatsu en onje a shajmi wachonje na sewen ka gimi jin chimino pimatsian we do kwa kakina ninchino and daganak na mishom sinan na gok misana shit nindondenis non go monje the bashka dagamak wam de ge kamashe denis wagonshe nongom we do kwa kakina wensi sak mitigog mijashki mashkiki kakina guch a shit we do kwa kakina we wisna jig the magus jig akos jig kaye we me god with jig nongom Chuana kiwach, a shit chimino pamatsu watch, can she squat negwe de semen, a shit can a noj guch negwe de semen, shwen mish non in abigus, miigwech, yeah, miigwech. For those of you who've seen me before, I say miigwech 4 times to honor the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 colors of people on this earth, the 4 elements, specifically the earth, the water, the fire, the air, because without them, we wouldn't have life here on Mother Earth. And why we call Earth Mother Earth is that, like a mother, she provides everything here for our well-being, to have a good life here. So, and one of the biggest teachings too, again, and I talk about the 4 colors of people, is that we were all given the instructions to be caretakers of the earth. And one of the biggest things with diversity is, regardless of the colors of our skin, you had the white, yellow, red, and black people, regardless of our backgrounds, the colors of our skin, our beliefs, our differences in language, our histories, what binds us together, whether we like it or not, is that we share the earth and the elements, the water, the fire, the air. So, because again, we're 72% water in our bodies. Without water, we wouldn't survive. And with the air, COVID was teaching us that how the air connects all of us. The fire, again, that's the internal fire of the earth. The fire of the sun that makes things grow. And your internal fire for having your journey here. And so I honor your discussion today for the public service, because again, everything is interconnected, and the public service for a public servant, you're looking after also too as well the well-being of the collective through also your legislation and policy. So I look forward to listening to the discussion. So, miigwech, everybody, and have a good discussion. Miigwech. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Verna, for the opening prayer and for the opening words. They're greatly appreciated, and I think they set us up well for the conversation and discussion that we will be having today. You touched on a number of things, including the fact that we are all caretakers of the earth and the elements, and obviously the public service has an important role to play. As you noted, we do have some challenges as well as opportunities, including in areas like representation in a number of areas. So thank you for the opening prayer and for the opening words. They're greatly appreciated.
Oh, miigwech, merci.
Merci. So at this point in time, of course, I want to say once again, welcome and thank you for joining us today with our virtual panelists, where we are going to be having the event again today on the Indigenous inclusion and well-being in the federal public service. At this point in time, I want to turn towards our distinguished and esteemed panelists to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. We have three people who are joining us today, so I will give them the opportunity to briefly introduce themselves, and I will start with Michael Mills. Michael?
Thanks, Lorenzo. Hi, I'm Michael Mills. I'm the Associate Deputy Minister with Public Service Procurement Canada. I've been with the Government of Canada for well over 25 years now, many different places. I'm very proud to be the champion of reconciliation at PSPC and kind of work with our Indigenous employees and more broadly to try and support reconciliation activities on the basis of PSPC and the Government of Canada. I am Métis. I'm from Western Canada, very proud to have been born in Manitoba and in the homeland of the Métis and to represent Métis with the federal government.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for being with us today. Prochainement, je vais me tourner peut-être vers Iliana pour lui donner l'opportunité de se présenter. Iliana?
Merci beaucoup. Donc, moi, c'est Eliana Laurston. Je suis conseillère principale en santé mentale pour Service Canada, mais je travaille pour le gouvernement fédéral depuis un bon 17 ans maintenant dans différents ministères. Puis j'ai vraiment une longue carrière, donc c'est toujours difficile de faire un résumé de ma carrière plus les années avancent. Donc, moi, j'ai commencé quand même en médecine traditionnelle et en psychothérapie. Puis c'est avec le temps que je me suis dit, bon, ben, je vais devenir infirmière. Tout ça, souvent, ça relie le tout. Donc, je travaille depuis quand même assez longtemps là, en santé mentale. Et puis, ben moi, avant ça, avant de travailler pour le gouvernement fédéral pendant 17 ans, j'ai travaillé pendant 10 ans dans plusieurs communautés autochtones à travers le Canada. J'ai commencé dans les territoires du Nord-Ouest. Hein, ça a été une grande surprise pour moi, très dépaysant. Donc, j'ai travaillé avec les Dene là-bas, que j'adore, plusieurs communautés, avec les Inuvialuit du nord, des territoires du Nord-Ouest. J'ai connu aussi les Cree dans le nord du Québec et finalement les Mohawks ici à Montréal. Puis les Mohawks, donc je travaille et je vis et je m'amuse sur le territoire non cédé des Mohawks en passant là, à Montréal. Donc ça, c'était un grand rêve pour moi. J'ai toujours senti un sentiment d'appartenance et je me suis toujours sentie rapprochée là, des communautés autochtones. Donc c'était un rêve pour moi d'aller un jour travailler dans les communautés. Je ne savais pas comment j'allais faire ça, mais c'est arrivé tout d'un coup là, par hasard, puis je suis contente de l'avoir fait. Donc voilà.
Superbe. Merci beaucoup, Eliana, pour avoir partagé avec nous aujourd'hui et pour être avec nous cet après-midi pour cet événement très, très spécial. Merci beaucoup. Last but certainly not least, we will turn to our good colleague Dylan to give him the opportunity to introduce himself as well. Dylan?
Miigwech. Dylan Jenkins, Indigenous cause, Makwadodum, North Bay, Ontario, Nindajubah. My name is Dylan Jenkins. I'm Bear Clan. I am Cree Anishinaabe. I've been in the public service now for into my 25th year. I'm currently the manager of the Inclusive Innovation team as we're setting up an Inclusive Innovation Hub at the National Research Council. It's the Industrial Research Assistance Program. So I've always been involved in whether from the corner of my desk or in positions that I've had within government to work with people and connect people with purpose, to empower people to be their own hero, and to move towards more humanized public service, a more human-centric, resilience-based approach to working together. And I've been integrating my Indigenous teachings from my elders, and I've worked with different elders from all kinds of different nations to bring an understanding as a two-spirit knowledge keeper into the public service. And so I enjoy incorporating, or I say braiding, my experiences as an Indigenous person, as Cree Anishinaabe, and also having my, as you can tell by my name, the Welsh and the Scottish roots as well, and to make Canada a better place. And it comes from a place of shared understanding. But we all have our truths to be shared, and many still to be shared. And it's an honor to be in this circle with everyone today. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Thank you to all three of you for introducing yourselves as well as for taking the time to be with us this afternoon for this important discussion and this important panel on Indigenous inclusion and well-being in the federal public service. Obviously, a number of things that you've already started to touch upon as part of the introduction. So to really kind of get this going, why don't we start with some of the questions that we have, where we're looking to be able to get your perspectives, your views, your inputs, your feedback on a couple of things. So, Dylan, maybe I can start the first question off with you. You talked about braiding some of the activities in terms of Indigenous culture and Indigenous history, in terms of the work that is being done. So the first question that I think we'd like to be able to discuss is, how can organizations adopt people-centric or centered approaches that truly reflect Indigenous values and foster inclusivity in the workplace?
Oh, thanks for the question. The first thing is we're all wired to tell stories, and we all love to talk about ourselves. And we know that from a Western perspective, but that was something that we understood from our traditional ways of governance and our communities before contact. And what that was is we share or we express ourselves, giving an opportunity to express ourselves, our truths, without judgment, but rather from a place of discernment. So our governance structures, the ways in which our communities functioned, were we were we always included. Like that was just the way it was. And when something is interconnected, there is going to be inclusion, no matter which way you look at it. And so when we start looking at workplaces from an EDI, I've always thought it was a bit backwards. And as somebody with contrary medicine, as we would say, as a two-spirit, it should be starting with inclusion. And inclusion isn't a thing, it's an action. It's about inviting people in, asking questions, interacting. Um, but storytelling is a huge part of it. And if there's anything that I've learned from my Indigenous colleagues, my Indigenous friends, my Indigenous family, we love to tell stories, and we tell them over and over again. And there's always something to learn from that. And each time we learn something, we're finding a new way forward. And sometimes those stories can take on a life of their own. But I think that's part of the beauty of it, of walking on this path together, is that it's not just an Indigenous practice, it's a human practice. And so, although we're focused on the Indigenous context here, I mean, to me, this is just human beings being human, and creating a workplace where it's people first, then process. People first, then the pomp and the circumstance, as one may say. And we all feel much better when we're able to bring our authentic self to work, but we need to have a safer place in order to do that. And that's where it starts, is being able to have people be able to tell you what does make a safer space for them and what invites them into that space, not just by the act of inviting them, but what do they find inviting as well, because it's the interconnection through relationship.
Thank you, Dylan. That's quite insightful and helpful. So thank you for that. I think the idea of being able to start with people and making sure that it's inclusive by default, and not having to work towards inclusion by giving people the opportunity to tell their story, I think is excellent. And particularly in terms of, as we look forward to be able to moving forward on people-centered approaches, obviously putting the people at the center would really be the critical element. So on that, I was actually wondering if, Michael, I might be able to turn to you, given your experience and also kind of growing up West. How do you see us making sure that we can adopt a people-centered approach that would really reflect Indigenous values and foster inclusivity?
I think what I would add would be to create the space for people to tell those stories, and also to take leadership and, in many cases, educate people that don't know that there's a very different view out there. There's different models, there's different ontologies, there's different epistemologies, and that's okay. And that try to create an environment where people are interested and curious to actually learn, and that creates the space for people to be able to tell those stories and to be able to talk about their values and bring those in. I think the other part too is to create spaces that Indigenous employees can actually see themselves in. And what I mean by that, like, having actual spaces, like having cumics, having lodges built into our workplaces where people can actually go and they can actually see Indigenous art, they can actually see symbols, they can meet with elders. I think the more you can do those kinds of things, create those spaces, people will actually see physical manifestations. And then I'd say, last but not least, would be to actually celebrate. We need to actually celebrate more. I think many of us have worked in around Indigenous policy for years. We always were dealing with, the Indigenous problem. How are we dealing with the Indigenous problem or this problem or that? We don't counterbalance that enough with celebration, and celebration's always been a very important part of I would say celebration and ceremony are been very important parts of kind of Indigenous livelihood. So I think we need to celebrate more. We need to stop at the summer solstice. We need to stop the winter solstice. We need to take time in September and actually celebrate and promote and use those as opportunities to tell those stories and create space for Indigenous employees to be proud.
Thank you for that, Michael. Very insightful. Je vais me tourner vers Eliana dans une seconde, mais je pense que vous avez mentionné l'idée qu'il y a différentes perspectives et différents points de vue sur le monde et qu'on doit créer des espaces qui sont où les personnes peuvent s'exprimer et avoir la chance de travailler dans ceci. Eliana, vous aviez mentionné pendant l'introduction que vous avez fait partie de plusieurs communautés et vous avez eu l'expérience avec différentes communautés autochtones et Premières Nations. Fait que je voulais savoir de votre perspective, comment est-ce que vous voyez ça, qu'on pourrait avoir une approche qui serait centrée sur les personnes pour être sûr qu'on favorise l'inclusivité et qu'on reflète vraiment les valeurs autochtones?
Merci, Lorenzo. Moi, cette question-là, ça m'amène beaucoup à penser aux valeurs autochtones. Moi, ayant, comme j'ai dit, été intéressée à aller voir ce qui se passait dans les différentes communautés, j'ai remarqué la première chose, c'est que les valeurs ne sont pas les mêmes au travers du Canada. Hein, chaque communauté a des valeurs spécifiques à elle. Évidemment qu'il y a des valeurs communes, là, mais chaque communauté, chaque individu dans les communautés ont des valeurs spécifiques à eux. Donc, moi, ce qui m'intéresse beaucoup, c'est l'individu. Quand je pense à cette question-là, je pense à l'individu parce qu'il faut se rappeler, moi, j'ai remarqué, j'ai observé et j'ai vécu, c'est mon vécu aussi, que quand on parle d'inclusion des employés autochtones au travail, on oublie souvent la double réalité qu'ils peuvent vivre quand ils appliquent à un travail au fédéral. Souvent, moi, dans les communautés, même moi, quand j'ai appliqué au gouvernement fédéral en 2008, mes copains autochtones m'ont dit « Pourquoi tu travaillerais pour le gouvernement fédéral? C'est un système qui nous a opprimés, donc pourquoi tu veux travailler de ce côté-là de la clôture? » Puis j'avais des belles réponses, moi, pour eux. J'en ai même écrit là, quelques-unes pour ne pas les oublier, mais tu sais, je me suis dit, hey, on peut faire des changements, influencer là, les politiques publiques, les décisions qui se font de toutes sortes de raisons, d'avoir accès à des ressources, à des formations qu'on n'aurait pas là, à l'extérieur. Suite à ça, bâtir des ponts avec les gens, leur apprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe dans les communautés, leur apprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe au niveau des gens autochtones, les valeurs justement autochtones, aider à mieux défendre les communautés, c'est très important, avoir cette information-là pour aider à mieux défendre les communautés. Donc, tout ça, c'est important. Puis finalement, ce que ça peut rapporter. Ça supporte, veut pas, la communauté quand on a quelqu'un qui travaille au niveau fédéral. Donc, moi, c'est la question que je pose pour répondre à cette question-là. C'est une fois qu'une personne sait pourquoi elle vient travailler au gouvernement fédéral, puis qu'elle est solide avec cette réponse-là en elle, bien, ça fait en sorte que les gens la perçoivent d'une façon assez différente. Puis les gens, après ça, il n'y a pas le choix que d'inclure cette personne-là dans l'espace parce qu'elle sait très bien pourquoi elle est là. Donc, c'est comme ça que je répondrais à cette question-là. C'est à ça que ça me faisait penser.
Merci beaucoup pour la réponse. Je pense qu'en fin de compte, votre réponse nous donne une bonne approche pour être capable de procéder à la prochaine question, parce que vous avez mentionné, on vous a posé la question, pourquoi est-ce que vous voudriez travailler pour le gouvernement fédéral? Étant donné l'histoire du gouvernement du Canada, vous avez commencé à donner certaines réponses sur la raison pour laquelle. Mais c'est sûr que nous avons et nous savons que les employés qui sont autochtones font face à des obstacles systémiques qui sont malheureusement non seulement au sein de la société canadienne, mais aussi dans la fonction publique. Alors, de votre perspective et basée sur votre expérience, comment est-ce que vous pensez que les organisations peuvent travailler de façon active pour éliminer ou réduire à un minimum réduire, mais préférablement éliminer les obstacles qui sont créés par les systèmes, puis s'assurer qu'on a des systèmes équitables. Peut-être, Eliana, comme vous avez donné une bonne réponse qui nous rentre à la deuxième question, est-ce que je pourrais rester avec vous?
Oui, absolument. Ben moi, dans mon rôle, souvent les gens viennent me jaser, me donnent quand même un retour là, sur ce qu'ils vivent là, dans leur milieu de travail. Donc, j'entends beaucoup qu'il y a énormément d'obstacles visibles. Donc, tout le manque de représentation des fois qui se fait à des postes de décision, des postes de haute gestion, les préjugés qu'ils peuvent vivre, hein, les préjugés malheureusement souvent inconscients de plus en plus parce que les gens ont de plus en plus d'informations là, en lien avec les communautés autochtones. Mais il reste quand même ils peuvent vivre des micro-agressions au travail, c'est toujours possible. Puis d'une certaine façon, c'est un environnement de travail qui ne prend pas compte de leur réalité culturelle. Donc ça, c'est encore très présent. Ce qu'on me rapporte beaucoup aussi, c'est beaucoup d'obstacles qui sont invisibles, des obstacles qui sont un petit peu plus difficiles à qualifier, à expliquer. C'est vraiment, je pense, je me fais souvent rapporter tout le langage bureaucratique, les acronymes, le jargon administratif. Je pense que ça, c'est tout le monde quand on commence au niveau du gouvernement fédéral. C'est comme d'apprendre un nouveau langage en soi. Là. Donc, ça, on me rapporte souvent ça. Puis le rythme du travail, je pense aussi. Toute la prise de décision qui, normalement, dans les communautés autochtones, moi, c'est ce que j'ai remarqué, c'est une belle prise de décision qui, en général, est collective et réfléchie, demande du temps. Mais ça, on a moins de temps. Hein? Dans un environnement de travail, c'est souvent normal. Là, au niveau corporatif, bien, ça va vite, ça court, ça court. Donc, c'est complètement différent et surréel pour certains employés. Donc, très important de remarquer ces obstacles-là, d'y penser, puis de se pencher dessus pour savoir comment on peut les enlever ou comment on peut s'adapter quand on est de l'autre côté de la culture. Donc, je pense que pour les employeurs, comment aider à les enlever un tout petit peu, c'est vraiment favoriser des échanges un petit peu plus organiques quand il y a des rencontres, des réunions, faire en sorte qu'on ralentisse un petit peu pour pouvoir aider aux décisions réfléchies, puis donner de la formation le plus possible, donner de la formation, puis faire en sorte peut-être de moins avoir des rencontres, des réunions, que ce soit en individuel ou en équipe, qui sont chronométrées, puis où est-ce qu'on a un but extrêmement direct, là, mais faire en sorte, là, comme je disais tout à l'heure, que ça soit un petit peu plus organique.
Merci beaucoup, Ileana. Ileana's raised a number of interesting elements, including speed of decision. So, Michael, I may turn to you next. I know that you're the Associate Deputy Minister in a large department that is transactionally focused. I have the pleasure of working with you on a daily basis, and you are a senior official who obviously is Métis. And you talked about the importance of space. So, given the differences in culture between kind of, the public service, including what Eliana was said, which is we even have within the bureaucracy our own language in terms of acronyms and the way that we speak and we operate, which is obviously quite different from Indigenous communities. So how can we as organizations kind of overcome some of the systemic barriers that Indigenous employees face so that we can kind of start getting rid of or dismantling or at least minimizing some of the challenges that Indigenous employees face?
Yeah, I've got a number of points. Like Ileana raised a couple of points. Like for me, there's two important aspects of culture. Culture can be viewed as a set of, I would say, informal norms, rules, regulations that kind of sits with your formal organizational rules. And the other part is some people view culture as the collective knowledge of a people that's transmitted in time, and that knowledge is encapsulated in language. So you take the way that things work, these norms, these rules, and you take language and you realize that that's where the space of cultural barriers. So I think if people just are aware of that, hey, wait a second, the words that I'm using have embedded knowledge, and I need to be reflective of what knowledge is in there, and I also need to be a bit reflective about what are the kind of informal norms and that I'm just taking for granted that I think that someone coming in is going to follow. And like, there's been lots of research on this in the sense that very successful kind of cross-cultural activities really happen where there's kind of, they call cultural fit, where there's not like the norms of one environment don't conflict, but in many cases they do. So I think being aware of that and actually thinking about that, reflecting on that, and trying to break it down. A couple of really practical things. The first one is um, the bureaucracy is a very large organization. It's a massive organization. And so just even getting acculturated to a big organization is going to be challenging for anyone. But I was lucky quand j'étais commencé ma carrière avec la fonction publique, j'ai commencé dans un domaine autochtone. Je travaillais avec Entreprises autochtones Canada. Donc pour moi, c'était un environnement totalement euh, culturel. C'était un environnement très excitant parce que tout le monde soutiennent le travail des entrepreneurs autochtones. Donc, c'était un environnement extraordinaire. Et pour moi, c'était une façon de travailler dans un environnement qui était pareil avec mon propre culture, mais aussi dans un environnement dans la fonction publique. Donc, c'était plus un moins vite d'entrer dans la fonction publique dans une grande organisation comme la fonction publique. So I would really encourage those opportunities maybe to look at can we try to bring people into maybe environments or programs and areas that we would, you know, it would be less of a jarring thing to you're not just going to a different cultural space, you're not going to this massive organization. Maybe you can have more points of connection and cultural connection that will launch you and create spaces for you to go on the other thing. The other part is we're in this program today. We are um, able to work across vast distances because of technology. Donc, c'est possible pour les jeunes travailleurs de rester dans la communauté, travailler avec la fonction publique et peut-être entrer dans une poste très loin de leur communauté avec, à l'aide des outils comme Teams et Zoom. So I think we should really look to can we structure the way we bring people into the public sector, maybe allowing them to start out their career in their community and then transition once they've got more comfortable in their job, in the organization, before saying, "Hey, we're gonna force you to leave a community." Move to Ottawa or Gatineau, work in this massive organization, work in an environment where they speak a totally different language. In fact, they speak two different languages than you speak, and they're going to follow a bunch of different processes and rule sets and kind of informal ways of working that is totally foreign to people. Like I think if we can, I think we ultimately will have to address a lot of those issues, but maybe we can do them in sequence as opposed to having to do them all in one big bang.
Thank you, Michael. I think yeah, the norms and language and obviously the importance of community, as I think something that will come up more as we discuss today. And so I want to also give Dylan the opportunity to provide kind of his perspective or his views on this. Dylan, in fact, you spoke about the importance of being able to tell our story, and of course the type of language that we use, the words that we use, how we choose to express ourselves is clearly an important part of that. You shared with us earlier today, speaking in your Indigenous language, which was fantastic. So I was wondering, from your perspective, if we could get kind of your views on the question.
Sure, Jimmy Glitch. The first thing that comes to mind is when it's about we're inviting, first of all, the inclusion. We want, Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit people to come and work for the Crown. Well, the first systemic barrier of that is the relationship, or shall I say, the lack of relationship, of a respectful relationship with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So there are historical systemic barriers that we will not rid ourselves of because they have happened, and we have to have this radical acceptance that this is what has happened. But in doing so, and we have a lot of this conversation around, the trauma and intergenerational trauma and stuff like this, as if this is only an Indigenous thing. I call this, and I've heard it coined before, the soft bigotry of low expectations. And I have to be honest that throughout my 25 years that I have seen it time and time again, that there's this idea that, first of all, we hear it in the work that we do as policy people. Indigenous youth are at risk. What if we changed that narrative for once and said they are at promise? And the difference that makes in the psyche of a First Nations youth, that they are at promise. allows them to move forward. And I would say that one of the other biggest systemic barriers within the public service is that it's like we can't move ahead as First Nations people. We're, yes, we have to do the truth and share what has happened in the past. Absolutely, we have to share our stories, as I've spoken about. But at the same time, we need to be able to allow First Nations people to move forward and not to have this idea that, oh, well, because of all of this that has happened historically, you may not make it. And so we're going to do all of these employment equity things for you. Okay, so what we're actually doing is we're reinforcing that we have a low expectation. We don't think you can attain this, when that is not the case, because Michael is sitting here. I am sitting here. So I know for myself, I didn't go through any special Indigenous this or Indigenous that. I came, from North Bay. I came to Ottawa. I told my family, I said, I'm going to go work for Indian Affairs, as it was called at the time. And this was after my mother's passing. And my father said, nobody in their right mind just goes to Ottawa and starts working for the government. And I said, this is my choice. I'm choosing to go and work for the federal government for a couple of reasons. Because I want to serve my people. So that's the first thing. It's the barrier sometimes is there's a lack of understanding that we come there to truly be public servants for our people. And some of us actually come here to heal. And in this case, I came here to heal. I wanted to find out what had happened to my family. And I did. I learned all of these things. Oh, I see why. Oh, they thought this and this. And so I got to come to an understanding. And through that, I share those stories as a sanctioned storyteller with everyone, but particularly young Indigenous public servants. And I say, you know what? Yeah, it's tough. It is going to be tough. But you knew that coming in here. And if we make it so soft that how do I climb? Like if I'm always on this pillow, how do I actually get to climb that ladder? How do I have the challenges that build that resilience? How do I connect with my colleagues if I'm always kind of othered? And I think that inclusion is about not othering. It's not about special this or special that. It's about tell me more. Let me learn. I want to learn. And when we share our truths, then we create, and we know this through the 7 grandfather teachings. The easiest way to break through these barriers is to honor those 7 grandfather teachings, respect and humility, right? So first there's the respect, then there's the humbleness. Then let's be brave and let's tell our truth, our honesty, being transparent. And then we interconnect that way. That's what love is. It's the interconnection. And once we interconnect, then we have a safer place to tell our truth. And all these different truths that we can tell, that's what will break down the systemic barriers. To give those places, because when all the truths come together and our elders know this, our grandmothers know this, our ancestors knew this, then we create wisdom. And that wisdom is the new way forward. It's the new way of doing new business. And so we have to be very careful with the language that we use. Maybe stop saying that Indigenous youth and Indigenous women are at risk. Yes, that is true, but they're also at promise. And so it's about bringing the balance of the perspective. If we're only looking at it from that, oh, poor you, then what we're creating are victims. And the crown doesn't need to be the villain in the story. We can all do this together. And that's where I come from when I'm like empowering people to be their own hero. It's like move forward, find what you need. But when those barriers are presented through couched in, oh, I'm here to help you, but I'm not going to let you come in too quickly, it gives the impression that they didn't have the capacity. And that, I think, is probably one of the most heartbreaking, because when I served as associate ombuds, albeit for a very short period of time at ISK, the stories that I heard from Indigenous employees, primarily Indigenous women and Two-Spirit, was it's like they think I'm dumb. And imagine coming to work every day a feeling that people around you think that you're dumb, that the entire bureaucracy think that you're dumb, when you're there to serve your people, and not just your people on reserve or in your Métis communities or in your Inuit land base, but all of us, because our teachings, it wasn't divided up as Elder Verna showed us. We are all interconnected, and we have to be doing this together. Miigwech.
Thank you, Dylan. Michael, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I fully agree with where Dylan is. Like, one of the things I've experienced over my entire career being kind of in and out of Indigenous policy is we a lot of times I think people in very good from a place of goodness really focus on we got to solve all these social problems. Then you say, well, what about these other opportunities, like these economic opportunities or these other places where people can, demonstrate their excellence? They always take a back seat to like solving the problem. And the other part about I like the soft pillow piece. I think another one we just need to be aware of is it is challenging, as Dylan Rains, to sit there and think about, are you okay working in an organization that has had very different relationship to your family and your people than it has to other Canadians? And it's not easy, and I don't think it should be easy. I actually think you may ultimately make the decision that it's not the place for you, but I think actually being courageous enough to challenge yourself to think through that, to have that debate in your head, to feel that tension, to really probe that question, because it's the same thing. It's the Indian Act has a lot of bad things, but the Indian Act isn't responsible for 100% of what's wrong in your life. Like, you have to find out, where am I responsible versus where's the external, and the only way you can do that is by actually confronting it and actually thinking through it. So ultimately, some people, it will not be the place for them, and I recognize that. But I do think if we're always worried about being so sensitive that we don't want anyone to have discomfort, I think sometimes you have to get to an honesty and to get to a wisdom, you have to have some discomfort.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dylan. I think you've raised a number of interesting points, including how we kind of create and get to wisdom. And Dylan, I'll pick up on something that you talked about, which is the even reframing so that we can talk about Indigenous youth that are at promise instead of being at risk. And that often has to do with kind of being able to influence both culture but also decision making. So I'd like to be able to use that to kind of move to another question that I think we'd be interested in getting the views of panelists on, which is we talk about one of the ways that we can talk about being able to change that narrative and moved from, just as Michael was saying, kind of, identifying the problem, but not just but fixing the problem, but also identifying opportunities. And Dylan, as I mentioned, you talked about Indigenous youth being at promise instead of at risk, kind of some shifts in terms of the way that we think about these things. Part of that is applying an Indigenous lens to how we undertake our activities, the workplace practices that we have, how we make decisions, how we frame questions, issues, concerns, and so on. So I think the next question I'd like to ask is, so what does it mean to apply kind of an Indigenous lens to workplace practices, to decision making, to how we frame issues and so on? And how can we apply an Indigenous lens to make sure that we're having changes on a positive way to organizational culture? And I'd say kind of from micro, in terms of individuals asking themselves questions of ourselves, all the way up to, the entire federal public service, which is, hundreds of federal departments and agencies, hundreds of thousands of employees. So I think I started with Michael last time, so I think I might actually come back to Dylan and give him the opportunity to go first this time. So I'm hopefully being equitable in terms of who gets to go first in responding. So Dylan, did you want to maybe start off on this one?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to, Lorenzo. I think that if, just simply put, how many public servants have been to a First Nation community, been to a Métis settlement area, have been up north? Some of us have, some of us have not. And in fact, another element to be mindful of is not all First Nations people have a reserve experience. For myself, I'm from York Factory First Nation. I never lived on the reserve. It was only became a reserve in 1986. But there's another side of the story. I'm the Hudson Bay Company experience. I'm the fur trade experience through my family. Okay, so how do we see? There's all kinds of different lenses. So we once again, and I say this respectfully, the Western way has always been one brush paints all, individualism. Whereas our communities, our ways of knowing and being were very collectivist. So what that would require is, and we're doing it much better now than we ever did from when I first started in the public service, is engagement. And then we hear, well, there's engagement fatigue. Well, yes, because we engage on every single little micro thing. It's how about going into communities and seeing for yourself and feeling for yourself? Because it's not just about seeing it, but it's also about feeling it. And so not all of us, we all have different experiences. So I don't speak to the reserve experience. I don't speak to my family's residential school experience because my mother went to a religious day school, albeit just as, unfortunate. So I don't speak to those because first of all, that's not my place to speak. So I haven't seen that. Do you know what I mean? I haven't sensed that. I haven't had that experience. So I think the first thing is when we talk about Indigenous cultural competency, well, the only person who can be truly competent in Indigenous culture is an Indigenous person. And I think this is where allyship comes in. It's let's walk this together. I've always been that AMA sort of person. If you want to ask me about this, ask me about that. I'm happy to tell. Then I have other colleagues who are like, I'm not here to educate everybody on this and that. And okay, that's fine. But then how do we learn? Because that's an exclusionary experience as well for others. It's like, well, I wanted to learn. So it's again coming back to that first teaching of respect. It's just, applying an Indigenous lens means you've had to have had that experience. And so I can't see the world through, a new Canadian's eyes. And we can even think of it as very simple as when we first started in the federal government, and many of us have been around, quite some time. I guess they call it dinosaurs now. We forget when these younger public servants come in, we're like, well, just do this and just do that, just do this and just do that, because we've grown so much. This is where we give back. That's the wisdom coming back, and we respect. Okay, you're in this space, so it's about giving something first before you get the knowledge through interacting with your Indigenous colleagues or Indigenous communities. But I would really encourage every public servant to have the chance to create relationships, right? It's not just ding dong, can I show up? It's about relationships. And so applying an Indigenous lens requires interconnection. We see things interconnectedly. And jokingly also, there's signs everywhere. As Indigenous people, it's like, oh, the bird flew by, that must meant something today. We see things very differently, but only because of our lived experiences. But if we were to look deep, and the elders remind us of this, to go within, we've all had very similar experiences. It is not just an Indigenous experience to be taken from family and community. It is not just an Indigenous experience. So it's about being vulnerable. So for those of us that have not had the Indigenous experience, I would encourage you to be vulnerable and say, I don't know. And that's hard for us in the public servants because we like to think of ourselves as the smarty pants. And we are smarty pantses, right? But we got to connect the head to the heart, and we can be emotionally intelligent as well. And it's about making those relationships in a respectful way, being humble. I know Dr. Nadia Ferreira does, cultural humility training, goes to various. I encourage that for every department to have an opportunity just to start there. And then that starts to create a place of safety because the Indigenous lens is about safety, care, comfort. It's not about we got to go do this as we typically are. So the Indigenous lens, think of it as just it chills everything out. It's not rose colored by any stretch of the imagination, but we slow things down. So when we hear, oh, Indian time, well, that can be seen as a bit of a microaggression, but the truth is what we mean is all in good time. Nothing needs to be rushed. The lens is one of connection, of compassion, of understanding, and that only gets, you know, removed when we're forced to look at things from another perspective. Like we can't just take off the lenses, whereas others can. So we have to be mindful that this isn't just about lenses. This is actually about lived experiences, but finding where we've had shared lived experiences and come to an understanding that way.
Thank you, Dylan, for your perspective on Indigenous lens or lenses. You kind of talked about the importance of interconnection, seeing things differently in terms of the lived experience, the need to be vulnerable, and all in good time in terms of the approach. So these are the kind of things that we want to be able to kind of highlight a little bit, because as part of being able to change the way that we do work, it will require us to be able to apply. And I realize, Dylan, that you said it's not a lens that we can kind of just put on and take off. But part of this is being able to increase the level of awareness that there are different perspectives and there are different modes of thinkings, and that there are different approaches that are used that are culturally important, that can help us from an organizational perspective. So with that, I might turn to Michael next, and then Ileana afterwards, in terms of kind of from your perspective, how can we apply Indigenous lenses to our workplace practices, and how can these help in terms of organizational culture and how we make decisions? Michael, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll raise a few that are more, I'd say, more specific, reflected on this. Like, first of all, um, I'd draw it back to like specific communities and cultures. So for me, I look at three that are specific to the Métis, and shared a bit with like our Cree cousins. First one is Mayo Pimatiswin, which is really about the good life, and it's about balance. And it's inner balance between kind of the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual, and thinking about how you live towards the good life in practice. But from a real events, like when I come back to the public sector, is you never actually get there. That it's part of practice. Like you're always in trying to every day live a good life. So you're always trying to find balance, and you may not always be balanced, but you will always strive to do that. So I think a lot of what we do in government, we think we can solve a problem, move on to the next one. We may not ever solve the problem. We may make it better. We may be working towards improvement, but we just need to work on the balance and be able to think about multiple things. Um, Similar to what was said a bit about relationality. So I do think about the concept of Wakodowin, which is really about our kinship relationships, that we are connected to everyone and everything, both living and non-living. So I really think about how do you build networks? How do you build relationships? I really believe what Dylan said around one of the first things that struck me when I came to PSBC and was working in real property was one of some people that worked for me were really nervous to go meet with the Algonquins of Ontario. And I'm like, well, why are you guys so worried? Because, well, we go once a year. We have this half-hour discussion. It's really tough. And I'm like, well, like, do you think you're maybe approaching this wrong? Like, you're in a relationship. Like, the Algonquins of Ontario aren't going anywhere. We're in Algonquin territory. So, like, we need to recognize we're in their territory. We need to build a relationship, and we need to go look about like, is once enough, or once a year visit enough to actually have a relationship and have a meaningful relationship. That's our start point. So I went there and basically said, here's who I am. We're in a relationship. We have to have a relationship. We're going to be working together forevermore. And so I want to talk to you about what I'm focused on today, what I'm focusing on 2 years from now, where I think we'll be in 10 years, get your feedback. We're not always going to get along. We're in a relationship. Sometimes you get along, sometimes you don't, but we need to have a relationship, and we need to be always building that and be conscientious of that. So I think just having that perspective about building networks, building relationships, being mindful of those connections. And then the last one I really try to bring is this concept of Tipemashuk, which is sometimes translated as freedom, but often translated literally as those that own themselves. So like entrepreneurial. So I really see it as trying to bring an entrepreneurial idea of like um, Elmer Ghostkeeper, a very famous Métis elder, has kind of viewed it as he called it Métis ways of doing, as kind of finding ways to do stuff. And that's to me what I try to think of on this entrepreneurial viewpoint of is how do we find a way to make something work or to solve a problem or to achieve a result and try to bring that up, always like saying like, let's not shy away, let's not back away, let's try and find a way to actually get it done and bring that attitude to work every day.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think the idea of being able to have the practice of good life and balance, I think a lot of us would struggle with that on a daily basis. But I think the idea that this is a practice and something that we need to kind of focus on and work towards or strive towards is I find it really insightful. And obviously relationships as well as the kind of entrepreneurial spirit. If I hope I'm kind of summarizing that greatly. We'll turn to our colleague Iliana to get her perspective, given her background in history. Sur ce point-ci, Iliana, encore une fois, j'aimerais savoir de votre perspective, comment est-ce qu'on peut appliquer une perspective autochtone aux pratiques dans le milieu de travail et comment ça peut influencer non seulement la culture, mais aussi la façon qu'on fait des décisions au sein de la fonction publique. Fait que je me tourne vers vous.
Merci, Lorenzo. Donc, moi, ce que ça me fait penser, cette question-là, c'est que moi, j'ai travaillé et je travaille toujours dans des milieux cliniques urbains que j'appelle, eurocentriques, parce qu'on a une clientèle beaucoup plus, disons, européenne. Puis dans les milieux urbains, quand des patients nous ont attendus, hein, souvent c'est malheureusement le cas depuis quelque temps, les patients ont attendu longtemps pour voir des médecins et des infirmières. Quand on s'assoit avec eux, souvent, les patients sont très impatients. C'est comme une course. Si on passe là une demi-heure avec eux, 1 heure, c'est une course. Ils ont une liste de questions à nous poser, des centaines de questions, puis nous, on répond, on donne le plus d'informations possible. Souvent, ça nous amène à d'autres questions. Ils veulent recevoir le plus de services possible. C'est vraiment comme un échange d'affaires. Et puis, je vous dirais qu'à la fin de ces entrevues-là, souvent, c'est très insatisfaisant et pour le professionnel de la santé et pour le patient, puis qu'on est épuisé. Les deux, dans les deux cas, on est épuisé. Puis moi, quand j'ai commencé à travailler en milieu communautaire autochtone, j'ai tout de suite remarqué que même quand je travaillais des quarts de travail de 12 heures, 16 heures, j'ai même travaillé 34 heures de suite à un moment donné parce qu'il y avait eu des urgences, jamais j'ai été épuisée. Puis je me suis posé la question, mais comment ça se fait? C'est le même travail, c'est du nursing, je réponds aux questions. Puis ce que j'ai remarqué, puis en jasant avec des collègues, on a remarqué la même chose, c'est qu'il y a vraiment un rythme naturel dans les communautés autochtones en lien avec tout ce qui les entoure. Donc, dans le cas de nos patients, si on revient à cet exemple-là, les patients souvent prenaient le temps d'avoir des périodes de silence, n'avaient pas nécessairement une longue liste de questions à poser. Ils y allaient de façon intuitive puis organique, échangeaient beaucoup avec nous. Je pense qu'une des raisons pour laquelle aussi je n'étais jamais épuisée, c'est que souvent mes patients sentaient le besoin de me donner quelque chose. Quand moi, j'apportais quelque chose d'important dans leur vie, quand je trouvais une solution à leurs problèmes puis qu'ils étaient extrêmement contents de ça, bien, ils voulaient avoir une réciprocité. Ils voulaient me donner quelque chose en échange. Donc, souvent, ils pouvaient me dire, bien, il y en a, fais attention à telle chose en ville ou bien, je vais te montrer telle chose, je vais te montrer comment ça fonctionne dans notre communauté à propos de telle chose. Il y avait toujours un échange, c'était circulaire. C'était complètement circulaire. Donc, ça changeait complètement la donne en termes de relations avec les gens de la communauté. Donc, moi, c'est comme ça que je répondrais. Les pratiques de travail, ayant toujours avec une perspective autochtone, c'est comme ça que ça devrait avoir l'air au travail. Donc, quelque chose de beaucoup plus circulaire, quelque chose de beaucoup plus fluide, plus organique, où est-ce que les gens échangent l'information, où est-ce qu'on ne court pas contre la montre pour essayer juste de remplir l'espace avec des mots, remplir l'espace avec des questions. Il y a des centaines de questions qui n'ont pas besoin d'être posées. Il faut vraiment aller au but de la chose. Il faut avoir une approche approche, je crois, qui est beaucoup moins transactionnelle. C'est ce qui, je crois, aiderait beaucoup. Si on pouvait amener cette perspective-là dans nos environnements de travail, il y aurait un changement énorme.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Iliana. Je pense que vous avez mentionné l'idée d'avoir une relation qui est beaucoup plus circulaire, puis des pratiques et des normes. Encore une fois, je pense que ça fait partie de qu'est-ce on a commencé et qu'on discute cet après-midi, qui est qu'il y a des approches qui sont bien certainement différentes et que ça peut nous donner plusieurs différentes pistes et d'avenues, non seulement pour être capable de trouver le côté positif et de voir comment on peut améliorer le tout, mais aussi qu'on peut s'assurer qu'on a des approches qui sont beaucoup plus en ligne avec les cultures autochtones. And that will actually be kind of a nice segue into another question that I have. And Dylan, I'll pick up on the fact that you mentioned in one of your responses the allyship and the importance of that. And that is often something that we hear, which is there are a lot of both opportunities but also challenges that are being faced. And often public servants will ask, well, how can I help as maybe a non-Indigenous person to be able to improve the situation? So the question really is about kind of what does meaningful allyship look like in supporting Indigenous colleagues, in supporting Indigenous communities, and how can we make sure that allies ensure that their actions are aligned with the needs of Indigenous communities? Fait que je sais que j'ai posé la question en anglais, mais je vais la répéter en français, puis je vais me tourner vers Iliana cette fois-ci pour la première, pour lui donner l'opportunité de répondre en premier. Puis après ça, on se tournera vers nos collègues Dylan et Michael à suite. Alors, Eliane, essentiellement, la question, c'est à quoi ressemble un soutien significatif en tant qu'allié pour les collègues autochtones et comment est-ce que les alliés peuvent-ils s'assurer que les actions répondent aux besoins des communautés autochtones?
Beaucoup encore. Il y a des thèmes que je vais peut-être reprendre à ce niveau-là parce que moi, il y a quelque chose qui me dérange depuis des années, déjà en partant, c'est le mot allié. Moi, je l'utilise quand on me dit est-ce que tu es un allié? Oui, j'accepte parce que je comprends qu'est-ce que c'est, mais je ne trouve pas que c'est le bon terme pour moi. Moi qui fais beaucoup de médecine traditionnelle, puis quand on parle de médecine traditionnelle, on parle de médecine traditionnelle de partout autour du monde, pas celle seulement au niveau des Autochtones, mais les principes sont les mêmes dans les médecines traditionnelles mondiales. On parle d'interconnexion. Hein, on en a parlé un petit peu aussi dans les premières questions. Donc, moi, je préfère dire que je me sens connectée, que je sens que je fais partie d'un phénomène d'interconnexion avec les Autochtones et non pas un allié. Un allié, je pense que j'ai utilisé le mot tout à l'heure, c'est transactionnel. Ça fait affaire, marché d'affaires. Je trouve que quand on est un allié, on est soit égal ou soit qu'il y a de l'équité entre les parties. Puis, il n'y en a pas encore, selon moi. Il y a vraiment beaucoup de déséquilibres systémiques, des déséquilibres sociaux qui sont persistants. Donc, on n'est pas des alliés. On est vraiment... Moi, je préfère être connectée. Puis les gens qui essaient de venir aider dans les communautés autochtones ne sont pas nécessairement des alliés. Puis je pense que Dylan a touché à quelque chose qui m'a fait réagir tout à l'heure. C'est de faire attention, connexion, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire se connecter aux autres? C'est beaucoup plus doux, c'est beaucoup plus dans la tentative de se connecter avec quelqu'un, donc de créer des liens avec ces gens-là, d'apprendre de ces gens-là. Puis ça, je dis ce mot-là, je l'ai vu, moi, je l'ai observé dans les communautés. Beaucoup de gens qui viennent de l'externe écoutent intellectuellement les gens dans les communautés expliquer ce qu'ils ont vécu, expliquer leur historique, expliquer tout ce qui s'est passé dans le passé, ce qui se passe aujourd'hui, et disent oui, je comprends ce que vous vivez. Ça ne sera jamais possible de comprendre ce qu'une personne vit. Moi, je le sais moi-même, je suis une femme noire. Je peux expliquer jusqu'à demain matin à quelqu'un d'autre qu'est-ce que c'est d'être une femme noire. Si on n'est pas une femme noire, on ne comprendra jamais complètement toutes les nuances puis toutes les choses qu'on vit tous les jours, à chaque minute. Donc, c'est la même chose avec les gens en communauté autochtone. Mais on peut en créant des connexions avec ces gens-là, vouloir au moins apprendre le plus possible, puis digérer le plus possible l'information qui nous est donnée. Donc, c'est de vraiment vouloir construire une relation qui est respectueuse le plus possible avec ces gens-là. Puis reconnaître d'une certaine façon que les réalités vécues, d'être sincère le plus possible, que ça ne soit pas vide de sens, autrement dit. Donc, ça prend un partenariat qui est authentique pour y arriver, pour s'assurer qu'il y ait une connexion et non pas des alliances. Donc ça, c'était mon petit mot. Je ne suis pas forte sur le mot alliance, mais en tout cas, c'est juste mon opinion à moi. Puis je pense qu'il est très important aussi, si on revient au monde du travail puis au gouvernement fédéral, de ne pas nécessairement embaucher des personnes autochtones pour répondre à des exigences de diversité. Il faut vraiment voir à quel point c'est un cadeau, c'est quelque chose d'extrêmement intéressant et important d'avoir des employés autochtones dans nos rangs. Donc, le gouvernement fédéral est vraiment chanceux, puis de voir ça comme une opportunité d'enrichir son organisation aussi, d'avoir des gens qui apportent une culture qui est riche de toutes sortes de façons.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Eliana, je pense que vous avez touché sur plusieurs aspects qui sont importants, surtout s'assurer que en tant qu'allié, on n'est pas en train de regarder ou utiliser des approches qui sont seulement transactionnelles, mais bien certainement qu'on a une bonne interconnexion à travers des relations respectueuses et un partenariat authentique. Fait que je pense des concepts qui sont importants au niveau de la conversation. But obviously, while the term ally or allyship has certain meanings and connotations, I think by and large, as Ileana was identifying, I think the view is that it's people who want to genuinely want to be able to have a positive impact, be able to help become more culturally sensitive or aware to the extent that they can be, and so on. So I'm interested in kind of the views of our other colleagues, and maybe I can start with Dylan in terms of what to your mind does meaningful allyship look like, and how can allies make sure that they're in their activities and what they do, that their actions kind of align with the needs of Indigenous communities?
Thank you. I think the biggest thing, or the most significant approach to allyship that I have experienced is being given space to be Indigenous and not having to ask to be Indigenous in the public service. So I have been very fortunate. I have to be honest here that I have had some outrageous sort of experiences as a First Nations person, as a Two-Spirit person, but they're outweighed by the meaningful allyship of time, space. And what I mean by that is, coach, get off the field. So sometimes what happens is, like, my experience has been everybody has always been very eager to support. I haven't, other than some perhaps microaggressions or some off-putting sort of comments and kind of assumptions and that kind of thing that we've had to navigate, I would say it's, we're at the table now. If I've been in the public service for as long as I've had, if Michael's been in the public service as long as he has, and there's many others who have been in the public service for a very long time who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and have had wonderful careers and long-serving careers, we've been here, and goes back to my point earlier. It's like, can we move ahead now? We are actually at the table, and so I've had experiences where very well-meaning, okay, you don't need to talk for me. You don't need to make it seem like I'm a victim. because what you're doing is you're actually perpetuating the stereotype. We are empowered now. It's one of the back to a systemic barriers. Okay, can you kind of back away now? Like, thanks, I appreciate it. So I think we're starting to move away from what I call reactive allyship to more responsive allyship. So I would encourage people who, when they want to, I want to be an ally, what can I do different? Let us do what we need to be doing. So, for example, if you have a situation where in the workplace where an employee, Indigenous employee, is kind of getting the gears about something and you're recognizing it, you don't have to come in, swoop in, and save me. Let's say I'm going through it. Okay, you don't have to swoop in and save me. I don't need, and then this is a term, the white savior. We don't need you to come in and save me. What you active, meaningful, responsive allyship is saying, I don't want that in my workplace. I don't want you treating Indigenous employees that way. It's no longer about the Indigenous employee, it's about the behavior. It's like, that's not tolerable here. What that creates is a sense of collective accountability. And it doesn't disempower the Indigenous employee. This is what we have to be mindful of, is being an ally. Please don't disempower an Indigenous employee. Rather, give them the space, maybe a little break to be like, holy, what's going on there? And then putting it, okay, yeah, like, I'm not going to tolerate that behavior, because it's actually not a cultural thing for us to speak up and promote ourselves. So we'll just kind of take it. And you don't understand that in that moment it's like, okay, am I going to be seen as this, and this, right? Because we wear that every day. No matter how professional, no matter how many years, no matter, you get triggered in those situations. Um, Allow people to work themselves out of what I would call triggered situations to the best of their ability. You only step in when it is clear that this is going to a place where there is just harm, where there's harm coming. It's not just, okay, well, he's being a bit difficult in the workplace. It's about where now there's a harm, because we know that as human beings. We know when somebody's being a jerk. We know when somebody's being disingenuous. And I think in places where perhaps we haven't been able to reclaim our place and space and circle and council, that it is the inclusivity, the active inclusivity. It's like, hey, so we've got, as the school has done here, it's like, come on in and talk with us. This is inclusivity in the public service. You have a place here. This is your space. You can talk now. And nobody's talking over, nobody's correcting, nobody's like, oh yeah, it's like this and it's like that. It all stands on its own. And I think as long as allyship is about keeping someone empowered, then that's always meaningful allyship.
Thank you, Dylan, for your perspectives. Michael, wanted to give you the opportunity as well in terms of your views on allyship.
Yeah, I think that a lot of it's been captured. I would just add that, yeah, we want looking for people that are, if you're a manager, you're going to give that person a chance. Maybe they don't have the same education. Maybe they don't have quite the same experience, but take a chance on someone that's a good employee. I think showing up to events and ceremonies, being open to like learn and understand is an important piece. And I keep coming back to this. We put a lot of emphasis on kind of the big pan-Indigenous word, just Indigenous this, Indigenous this. I would ask also people to really get focused on where they are. Like indigeneity is like tied to the land. You're tied to, and the land is where you are. It's not tied to land that's across the globe. It's tied to where the locality of where you are. So, people that'll genuinely take interest, they'll listen to your stories, they'll create space, and that will actually show that, listen, they're going to try and take active measures to understand, like, whose land are they on? What does that mean? What language do they speak? What's their history? And what's the impact that they're having on that land and that kind of relationality? So to me, it's like, if people can be genuine, show that, it'll radiate and it'll create a better environment for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And I think all of you have kind of highlighted a couple of things that really have to do with kind of in terms of allyship, also kind of talks about or links to cultural appropriate practices. So the next question that I'm going to ask to all of you is, how can leaders integrate culturally appropriate practices in their leadership style to support their Indigenous team members in order to be able to foster a respectful work environment? Dylan, you mentioned that activities should not don't disempower people when you're trying to do it. Michael spoke about ceremonies and events, but also the importance of indigeneity and the ties to the land. And Ileana spoke about authentic partnerships and making sure that we have relationships that are built on sincerity and that are respectful. So for each one of you, though, often when we talk about Indigenous culture, how can leaders make sure, in the context of being allies, but also just in terms of managing teams, how can they integrate culturally appropriate practices in their leadership styles so that we can encourage and support Indigenous team members within our work environments? I'm doing a bad job. I've lost track of who I've asked first, so I will kind of not arbitrarily go. I'll go to Dylan first, followed by Michael, and maybe we'll end this question with Ileana. So Dylan, did you want to go first?
Sure. I think one of the key elements is learning what it was like so we're in the bureaucracy, we're the public service. We had our own sort of public service practices. There, it wasn't quite as the pomp and circumstance. We had our ceremonies, of course. Um, Leaders lead people. You don't lead files, you lead people. So you have to connect to your people. So a cultural practice that I've actually incorporated in the work that I do, and it met with a little bit of, at first, but not from the organization, but just from, I think, a lack of understanding. And so we have the giveaway. So you'll have that at some ceremonies, and we have feasts, and we have the potlatch. And so what that is, it's the balancing of power within a community, within a group. And because we didn't understand power and control, we understood care, comfort for cultural perpetuity, so self-actualization and community actualization. And so, and some of us actually do this, but if you do it in the context of the giveaway, so the Bear Circle, for example, which was being led out of Indigenous Services Canada, they would have an opportunity to meet with an elder every couple of months, and we would talk about policy, and we would talk about it not in the context of the way we think of it as bureaucrats, but rather about people, hopes, dreams, fears. Where do people want to be going? And using different methodologies to evaluate. For one of the elements that we would talk about is how we evaluate programs and policies. And so we were incorporating through, and this was Elizabeth McDonald, Métis, who this was her vision, and worked with elders Solomon Wawati and Elder Barbara Brandt. Some other elders came in as well, and a lot of guidance with this. People just started feeling like, hey, we belong to something, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. It became a space where we could be okay just within ourselves as professionals. And what started happening was that professional kind of self we bring to the space started relaxing, and we started having, as Ileana is talking about, those sincere relationships. And so part of that, so we do sharing circle, we get the teaching, which is really just elders reminding us of things we've forgotten. Then there would be the giveaway. So at work, at NRC, I had invited my team to do so, and then lovely enough, the Bear Circle at ISK actually had chosen some items of the giveaway and brought them to me and said, this is to honor you for coming to our circle and having them come and sit with us. And so you see, it's reciprocity. We don't have a lot of reciprocity, I find, in the government. What we have is more of the I need this, I want this. And I remember this wonderful story that a wonderful colleague of mine and friend, Melvin Musqua, told me about how when he went to go talk to an elder, and he himself, being Soto, went to go talk to an elder, and the elder made him do dishes and made him make tea and made him do all kinds of things before she provided the answers. So you see, it's a place of reciprocity where we don't have the hierarchy. So we had roles and responsibilities. We didn't have a hierarchy. So our Okima, our leadership, would bring in people from different perspectives in order to figure out what is best for the all. And we tend to do what is best for the one as opposed to what is best for the all. And when you have that interconnection, those meaningful, sincere relationships, that's what empowers teams. That's an Indigenous practice. That's a First Nations practice. That was our way of governing. You can incorporate this in all kinds of different ways within your work environments. And I would encourage you to bring in elders, knowledge keepers, artists, storytellers to come in and to make those connections, because it's just not in theory, it has to be experiential learning. And so that's what I would say is incorporate more experiential learning as well. So you're having the experience, and then that way you're seeing it and you're feeling it, and it becomes a truth for you as well.
Thank you, Dylan. We'll turn to Michael next. I know that Dylan has given us a couple of examples, and I know that, for example, within Public Service Procurement Canada, we do use elders to be able to help, on certain initiatives or certain files in terms of being able to do some of the things that Dylan was speaking about. But Michael was wondering if you wanted to provide us with your views in terms of how leaders can integrate culturally appropriate practices.
Yeah, I do think incorporating elders is an important thing, particularly if you have a very, I'd say, tough issue to kind of go through. Like, my view is that the elders can put everyone in the right frame of mind going off, that they can participate in discussions and actually contribute and also kind of redirect the discussion or continue to sustain a positive energy that will help you get to a solution. And that sometimes they can bring a very different perspective at the end to help you wrap it up, that you may not solve a problem that day, but it sets you off to go have a reflection that comes back with a better outcome. To me, that's important. Some other practical ways we can do it is, there are traditional teachings. There are like, the Métis giving tree and stuff that have values. As organizations, often we actually write up value statements. We post them on the wall and we show people. The practical thing we could do is bring some of these other kind of value statements from the Indigenous world and post them on the wall and let people think about them and have discussions about them, and what do they mean in your life, and do they resonate or not, and why not? Like, I think just even doing that and having that conversation, really, Dylan's point about reciprocity really resonated with me, because there's a concept about the whole world is a gift, right? That the creator created the world, put all the knowledge out in the world, put everything into the world, and that every time we use anything or we get a piece of knowledge, we should actually give thanks, and there should be an actual a physical manifestation, a tiny gift to kind of reciprocate the fact that you've got that. So I think if we can bring more of that in, and it's not equal. Reciprocity is not about equal. Say if someone's working for you and they give 10 hours of labor to write a paper, maybe you're only giving a thanks, or you're giving praise, or you're sharing the ideas with the rest of your team, and really acknowledging someone. It's not necessarily that you're doing the equal amount of effort, but that reciprocity is super important, because you're recognizing the gift of that person's effort and what they've given back. So trying to do that. The last thing I think is really important is I try to do is, like, I'm pretty structured in terms of organization, which Lorenzo can tell you, but I try to also have an informal, and my informal governance is also is my form of kind of the sharing circle. Maybe I need to start calling that more, where I actually want to hear a diversity of views. But that doesn't mean, like, I know that sometimes we hear all Indigenous people are very consensus based. I believe in consensus of understanding, but not consensus of action or decision. Like we have to hear a wide variety of positions. We ultimately have to find a way to make a decision, and not everyone's going to be on the same page. And but everyone needs to be able to be given the space to talk. We need to be respectful and hear their voices, hear their perspectives, weigh them, and make a decision. And for me, it's really important to make sure that people feel that they have the space to give their views and that their views are respected, even if they're not accepted. And that's not always easy to do. It's not always seen. I know a lot of times I'm very direct. I make decisions quickly, and people think I'm not respecting. But I do try to think about how to make sure that people know I'm hearing them, I'm appreciating them, I'm respecting their ideas, even if I have to go in a different direction. So that's something that's try to do. Not like everyone else, fallible, make mistakes, and not do it imperfectly, but try to incorporate that and kind of model that.
Thank you, Michael. And since I work with you, I'll just quickly say that I can echo that and say that I've seen it in practice. I think Michael does give people certainly a lot of time and space to be able to for us to be able to share our views and perspectives. Although he often is called upon to have to make decisions, often in short time frames. But the idea of the consensus on understanding, but not necessarily on decisions, I think is an important one. And both Michael and Dylan picked up on the idea or the concept of reciprocity as being something that is kind of, an important element in terms of practices. Je voudrais maintenant me tourner vers Eliana pour lui donner à elle aussi l'opportunité de fournir sa perspective. Alors, Eliana, de votre côté, comment est-ce que vous pensez que les leaders peuvent intégrer les pratiques culturelles appropriées dans leur style de leadership pour mieux soutenir les membres autochtones des équipes et favoriser un environnement de travail qui est respectueux?
Merci pour la question. Donc, moi, pour cette question-là, j'ai pensé à deux petites histoires, des faits vécus, des choses que j'ai vécues. Puis la première histoire, c'était vraiment mon travail chez les communautés d'aînés dans les territoires du Nord-Ouest. À un moment donné, j'étais en train de travailler à la clinique avec un jeune adolescent, un jeune homme, puis ce jeune homme-là avait des problématiques de santé, dont certains handicaps. Puis les gens de la communauté, tout fermait, à peu près tous les magasins, tous les endroits fermaient un peu partout. Je ne savais pas ce qui se passait. Il y avait un branle-bas de combat. Puis on m'a expliqué que les chasseurs allaient partir, sortir de la communauté. Puis souvent, c'est tellement excitant de voir les chasseurs. Les chasseurs, c'est comme des super-héros dans le Grand Nord. Donc, les gens, souvent, vont laisser fermer leurs emplois puis suivre les chasseurs pour voir ce qui se passe. Donc, on est venu me voir pour dire redonne-nous notre jeune homme de 16 ans, on a besoin de lui en ce moment. Puis j'ai dit ah oui, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Puis ils ont dit bien, il fait partie du groupe de chasseurs. Le groupe de chasseurs avait environ 3 ou 4 personnes. Ils ont dit il fait partie du groupe de chasseurs parce que son rôle, c'est d'entrer en connexion avec les animaux. Puis j'ai dit mon Dieu, ça m'a touchée énormément parce que en santé mentale, on sait que c'est très, très, très important qu'une personne a un rôle très spécifique dans un groupe. Donc, c'est très important pour le leadership, pour les gens qui sont dans des positions de leader, de savoir quel est le rôle, qu'est-ce que la personne aime avoir comme rôle. Moi, par exemple, j'aime ça être une guérisseuse, j'aime ça être une personne qui aide les gens à guérir. C'est pas moi qui guéris les autres, hein? Les gens se guérissent eux-mêmes, puis moi, je suis là pour les supporter à guérir. Donc, si les gens reconnaissent ça chez moi, si je m'en vais dans un groupe de gens, puis les gens disent oui, il y en a, on la reconnaît comme ayant ce rôle-là. Non seulement ça me fait plaisir, mais ça m'aide, ça aide au niveau du leadership. Donc, ça, c'est ma première histoire. Très important de donner des rôles ou de laisser les gens prendre une place, un rôle très spécifique dans l'équipe. Donc, deuxième histoire que ça m'a fait passer, quand j'étais en communauté autochtone pendant 10 ans, les infirmières, moi, j'ai travaillé dans des centres de santé où j'étais tout seule comme infirmière, ou j'ai travaillé dans des centres de santé où il y avait 8, 9 infirmières parce que les communautés étaient pas mal plus grosses. Et puis, quand on était beaucoup, beaucoup d'infirmières, il y avait évidemment une infirmière-chef. Souvent, l'infirmière-chef ou l'infirmier-chef a beaucoup d'années d'expérience, 30 ans, 40 ans d'expérience, tandis que les autres infirmières ont différents nombre d'années d'expérience. Mais quand il y avait une urgence, que ce soit une urgence parce qu'il y avait eu un accident de voiture ou une urgence parce qu'il y avait une dame qui était en train d'accoucher de façon urgente, ce n'est pas nécessairement le leader, ce n'était pas nécessairement l'infirmière-chef qui allait être en charge de la situation. C'était l'infirmière dans le groupe qui avait le plus d'expérience avec la situation en question, donc l'urgence en question. Donc, même s'il y avait une infirmière dans le groupe qui avait seulement 3 ans ou 4 ans d'expérience en tant qu'infirmière, qui était sortie de l'école depuis seulement 3 ou 4 ans, mais qui avait travaillé 3 ou 4 ans en obstétrique et qui était capable d'aider quelqu'un à accoucher, bien, c'est cette personne-là qui était en charge pendant la durée de l'urgence. Ça, j'ai trouvé ça très beau. Puis je pense que c'est très important pour les leaders, quand on s'occupe d'être en charge, de faire du leadership, de reconnaître le talent et la compétence des gens. Puis le talent et la compétence, ça vient des fois, pas nécessairement du poste qu'on a en ce moment. Souvent, les gens travaillent avec nous, ils ont opéré dans d'autres postes pendant des années avant ça, ou bien ils ont des hobbies à l'extérieur du travail qui font en sorte qu'ils ont des talents et des compétences dont on n'est pas au courant. Donc, il faut aller chercher à savoir quels sont ces talents-là, quelles sont ces compétences pour offrir un modèle, je crois, de leadership qui est beaucoup plus flexible. Donc, je pense que ces deux histoires-là, ça m'a touchée, puis ça m'a montré à quel point c'est possible d'utiliser des techniques ou des façons de faire autochtones, puis de les amener à améliorer le leadership dans un milieu de travail.
Merci beaucoup, Eliana. Je pense que l'importance du talent et des compétences que vous avez mentionnées ne veut pas nécessairement dire parce que quelqu'un est dans un poste spécifique, il y a des personnes autour de nous qui peuvent avoir un talent, une compétence qui peut nous aider à être capable de traiter avec la situation ou l'enjeu. Et l'autre chose que vous avez mentionné, c'est bien certainement le rôle des personnes dans les équipes et l'importance de ça. Puis vous avez mentionné aussi l'impact que ça peut avoir du côté positif sur la santé mentale. Alors, avec ça, en fin de compte, je vais poser une autre question qui vraiment est au cœur de la conversation que nous sommes en train d'avoir cet après-midi. Puis je vais peut-être, étant donné que vous travaillez dans le domaine, Eliana, je vais peut-être vous poser la question en premier, puis après ça, donner l'opportunité à Michael et de Dylan de suivre après. Mais c'est vraiment la question sur la santé mentale qui est comment est-ce que les milieux de travail peuvent-ils soutenir la santé mentale et le bien-être des employés autochtones en intégrant les pratiques et les ressources culturelles qui sont pertinentes. Et comme on a discuté cet après-midi, c'est sûr que c'est quand même une question assez vaste au niveau des cultures, mais néanmoins, étant donné votre background, je pense qu'on serait intéressé à voir de votre perspective, qu'est-ce que vous pensez qu'on pourrait faire pour rendre nos milieux de travail encore plus sains au niveau de la santé mentale?
Je pense que cette question-là, c'est mon cheval de bataille ici au gouvernement fédéral. Étant donné que j'aime beaucoup la médecine traditionnelle, moi, je fais toutes les formations que je fais, toutes les conférences que je donne sont toujours ce que j'appelle culturellement sécuritaires. Je fais attention de parler de tout ce qui se passe autour du monde et non pas seulement en Amérique du Nord et non pas seulement dans les milieux urbains. Donc ça, je fais attention à ça. Donc, pour ce qui est des employés autochtones, moi, il y a quelque chose que j'aimerais commencer par dire, c'est qu'au Canada, les pourvoyeurs de santé, surtout santé psychologique, services de soutien psychologique de toutes sortes, que ce soit des travailleurs sociaux, que ce soit des psychologues, malheureusement, selon moi, ont des approches qu'on appelle eurocentriques. Donc, on pense surtout à la thérapie qui s'appelle la thérapie cognitivo-comportementale. Je pense que 98% des pourvoyeurs de santé psychologique qui vont donner des services à la PAE. Hein. Souvent, on dit à nos employés, allez vers la PAE, allez vers la PAE. Bien, malheureusement, 98% des gens qui donnent des services-là, ils utilisent cette thérapie-là. Puis pourquoi qu'ils utilisent cette thérapie-là? Elle est très populaire dans les universités. Elle est très populaire parmi les ordres que ces gens-là, auxquels ces gens-là doivent répondre. C'est que c'est une thérapie qui est vraiment axée sur la performance. Sur l'efficacité, sur la résolution rapide de problèmes. Là. Moi, j'appelle ça de la thérapie corporative. OK? C'est assez sec. C'est pas du tout adapté aux réalités autochtones. Donc, ça, très important à savoir parce que ces genres de thérapies-là, par exemple, elles vont individualiser les problèmes. Elles vont dire, vous avez un problème, puis on va vous régler votre problème à vous. On va tenter de vous arranger, de vous aider, vous, dans votre problème. Quand on sait que les problèmes de santé physique ou les problèmes de santé mentale, ils sont multifactoriels. Ils peuvent être des problèmes physiques que la personne a. Ça peut être un problème de diabète, d'hypertension, d'autres maladies chroniques. La personne peut avoir, comme on sait tous, des problèmes émotionnels. Je pense que les gens, c'est tout ce qu'ils pensent au niveau émotionnel. Mais les gens ont des problèmes, il y a d'autres facteurs, donc il y a des problèmes sociaux, des problèmes environnementaux, des problèmes avec leur famille, leur communauté, des problèmes spirituels. Puis dans le cas de beaucoup de gens qui viennent travailler au gouvernement fédéral, dont aussi les Autochtones, des problèmes historiques, donc multifactoriels. Donc on ne veut pas seulement prendre soin de l'individu, on veut prendre soin de tout ce qui l'entoure. Donc, dans les traditions de guérison autochtone que moi j'ai pu observer, puis avec lesquelles j'ai pu mettre la main à la pâte puis travailler, on ne s'occupe pas seulement de la personne, l'intervention n'est pas seulement au niveau individuel, l'intervention, elle est communautaire. Il y a vraiment une question d'interconnexion avec tout le monde, avec la nature, avec les rituels dans les communautés, avec les aînés. Donc, moi, ma suggestion numéro 1 pour le gouvernement fédéral, je ne sais pas si c'est possible, mais ma suggestion numéro 1, ça serait vraiment d'embaucher des aînés à la PAE pour donner des services, du support moral, du support émotionnel et de santé mentale qui est beaucoup plus adapté aux employés autochtones. Je suis sûre que ça serait rempli, le rendez-vous serait rempli, en plus de donner des emplois aux aînés dans les communautés. Donc ça, c'est ma suggestion numéro 1. Puis numéro 2, si ce n'est pas possible d'avoir des aînés, c'est vraiment de créer des espaces où les employés peuvent partager le plus possible leur culture. C'est de laisser évidemment des journées spéciales, de laisser aller les employés quand ils ont besoin d'aller à des cérémonies dans leur communauté, d'aller faire des choses comme ça. Donc, de ne pas poser la question, de ne pas nommer ça non plus. Ce n'est pas obligé d'être un congé de maladie, ce n'est pas obligé d'être un congé de santé mentale. C'est un congé pour maintenir, c'est un congé préventif pour maintenir la santé. Puis il y a d'autres formes alternatives d'aide un peu partout si on n'en trouve pas, parce que je le sais, je le dis vite là en ce moment, je le sais que les gens me disent souvent quand ils font appel à des services, ça prend du temps, 6 mois, 1 an pour recevoir des services de nos jours là, en ce moment. Donc, il y a d'autres formes d'aide qu'on peut aller chercher ailleurs, comme des leaders religieux si ça intéresse les gens, comme des aînés dans votre communauté, des membres de votre famille. Donc, voilà.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Deux suggestions très utiles et très pratico-pratiques. Je vous dire la vérité, je ne suis pas sûr pour la première, mais je pense que même si on ne peut pas mettre des aînés dans le centre, avoir plus d'aînés dans les organisations ou avoir accès à leurs connaissances, à leurs services, à leurs perspectives, je pense que ça aussi, ça serait quelque chose qui pourrait bien certainement aider les différents ministères et les différentes organisations. Alors, merci beaucoup, Eliana, pour votre perspective. Michael, I'd like to turn to you next in terms of, again, looking at how we can ensure that workplaces better support the mental health and well-being of Indigenous employees. I know Eliana has given us a couple of ideas in terms of how that could be, but wanted to kind of get your perspectives on it. Oh, you're on mute, Mike.
Je m'excuse. D'abord, je vais te dire quelque chose de controverse parce que de mon point de vue, c'est impossible de parler seulement de santé mentale parce qu'il y a 4 aspects de l'humanité, mental, émotionnel, physique et aussi spirituel. Et il y a des liens très profonds entre les 4 et il faut avoir une perspective compréhensive comme individu. Donc, il faut réfléchir, il faut mettre l'emphase et la concentration sur les 4 aspects en même temps. Pour moi, c'est vraiment une bonne étape. Mais comme Liliana a mentionné, en réfléchissant de 4 aspects, il faut penser sur les relations sociales et les relations avec la terre, parce que c'est vraiment la connexion avec la terre qui donne le pouvoir, un bon esprit et qui donne une très bien santé mentale et physique, émotionnelle et spirituelle. Donc, pour moi, c'est vraiment d'assurer des bonnes relations et socialement, mais aussi avec le terre, mais en prenant connaissance des interactions des aspects émotionnels, physiques, mentaux et spirituels.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup, Michael. Dylan, I wanted to turn to you next to be able to get your perspectives. Ileana has spoken to us about the need to be able to create space for people to be able to participate in and to be able to kind of focus on Indigenous culture. Talked about the challenges that are faced with some of the practices that are used in psychological therapy and services that are really focused on trying to focus on an individual instead of kind of a broader community, and the idea that elders can provide great perspective and insights. Michael just spoke about the importance not just of kind of the social element to it, but also kind of the connection to the land as a means of having kind of an approach of mental health that is kind of holistic in terms of body, spirit, mind, so on. But want to turn to you in terms of your perspective of how the workplaces can better support mental health and the well-being of Indigenous employees by incorporating culturally relevant practices and approaches.
Well, I think thanks for the question, and I think that my colleagues have spoken to it very eloquently. And what I would add is, and I think this is for anyone, it's that we need to suspend judgment. And so, because we're in a bureaucratic space, and we seem to be connected to all of these different this policy, that policy, well, the policy on leave says this, and the policy of that says that. They are policies. They're not. It's not hard law. It's some of this can be opened up to interpretation, and I think that it really boils down to what I would say collectively character leadership. You as a leader, and all of us as leaders, because we're all leaders to our in certain in all different degrees, is the to exercise compassion. That moment of, okay, what would I want in this moment? And if you don't know what this person is going through, um, suspend judgment. Because if you don't know, you don't know. And the less you know, the more you make up. And we have a tendency to do that. So I'll give an example when and I will say the trigger warning here, when the 215 were announced of our children that had been located or believed to be located, that impacted every First Nation, Métis, and Inuit person, every single one, because of the interconnection, right? So we've talked about that, and because we all have these stories. Again, it's the stories, the interconnection of our stories, and so the way in which we think, the word mental health, the way we are thinking, it's the feedback that we're getting. So, how do we support Indigenous mental well-being in the workplace? Well, think about, what are you putting out there? Are you putting out resistance? Are you putting out dismissiveness? Are you putting out that's going to create a place of fear? Is going to create a place of, am I going to be punished? Or am I going to be rewarded? Don't weaponize policies. And I've seen that we have weaponized, well, according to this and according to that. It lets human beings be human. Again, as leaders, we're leading people. It's not a file. We're not leading a policy. We're leading people. And there's cultural experiences that are going to happen, that are going to have impacts. Of course, there is the intergenerational trauma. And so I think that, quite frankly, if we started practicing more that trauma-informed approach to management, to leadership, everybody benefits from that. And it really just starts with, not just cognitive empathy, like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, but effective, because that person should feel that they are supported, that they are cared about, that we understand. We may not fully understand, but we know that they are feeling something and thinking in you just go, okay, something's going on here. My job isn't to judge and decide if it's real bad or if it's not. It's what can I do? Tell me more. What can I do to support you? Ultimately, it's you ask the person because it's within, and okay, well, I'm connected to this. So I had a situation where it turned out that this person's mental health and First Nations person's mental health was just really, it was tanking. And I wasn't quite sure where this was kind of coming from, but I was noticing it. And so I simply made acknowledged. I said, it appears to me. I didn't judge. I used discernment. I said, it appears to me you're struggling. Did you want to talk about it? And in that moment, it said yes. We went into the boardroom, and it was just tears upon tears upon tears. And so, that to Leanna's point, give space. And yeah, we're not trained in mental health trauma, but I would encourage everyone. There is a, mo- a module for mental health first aid about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities. I would encourage that for all public servants to take. Um, because there are nuances that go a little bit beyond just the human experience. And so I say, how do we support? We learn how to support, and we do that by asking, by being vulnerable ourselves, and not thinking we have to solve the problem, but empower, as I say, what do you want for the outcome for this, and how can I assist?
Great, thank you for that. Those were helpful insights. I am being mindful of the time. We will have time maybe to kind of have one more question answered, and it'll pick up on some of the things that have already kind of been mentioned. Dylan, you highlighted and spoke about the fact that people need to make sure that they're being supported, that they're not being judged, and the mental health first aid, training is something that is helpful. One of the things that we often hear is that, oftentimes, unfortunately, those who are Indigenous and Indigenous employees might be faced with or facing microaggression and unconscious bias. And I recognize that before you talked about give people space, that you don't necessarily need to have kind of, a savior come in. You talked about the behavior and making sure that that behavior, which would be, inappropriate for anybody, regardless of what it is, that we're kind of taking care of that. But obviously, this is something that, is a concern in terms of microaggressions and unconscious bias. So how can we kind of proactively address some of these challenges that Indigenous employees kind of face? So I'll give everybody the opportunity to provide a response to this question, and then we'll start to kind of wrap it up. So Dylan, since you kind of answered the last question with a bit of a lead in, I don't know if I can maybe ask you to kind of continue on that one.
Yeah, sure. I think that first of all, I think that we can't prevent microaggressions, and we certainly have no way of preventing unconscious biases because those are unconscious and the person's not even aware that they have them. But what we can do is acknowledge and accept that this is what happens. So I've had an experience where somebody said, there's at a particular department, yeah, there's doesn't seem to be any racism here. And I thought, well, that's quite rich. You are a non-indigenous individual saying that there doesn't seem to be racism against indigenous peoples. Again, that's the blinders, the myopia that we sometimes get, or the cognitive dissonance. So we can't prevent it. So that self alone, like, was a microaggression. Like as gaslighting. It's institutional gaslighting. So we can address institutional gaslighting by saying, no, it happens here. And it's leadership who has to say that. And that takes vulnerability and takes bravery and honesty to say it happens here. And it's hurtful and it's harmful and it is no longer tolerated. Most of us as adults are fully aware of what we are saying and what we are doing and what the impact of that is going to be. I would say that most public servants are good people. And what I mean by that, not nice people, they're good people. They know that you treat people with respect, you treat people with compassion and kindness and understanding. And so microaggressions often come from, you know, My goodness, my father had plenty that if I was to still speak of how my father spoke back in the 70s and 80s, it's like Archie Bunker, and that's dating myself. Um, Ask First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit people, Middle Eastern people, ask anybody. What are some things you hear that you consider to be a microaggression? Because it shouldn't come from somebody who hasn't had that kind of experience. It has to come from the person. Like, so for example, somebody calling me chief. Don't call me chief. That's microaggression. Um, but some, oh, I didn't mean that. And oftentimes people don't mean it. They didn't understand that there was a connotation, a negative connotation to that at the time, and it doesn't necessarily have it now, but it's the disconnect in that journey of growth and understanding. So microaggressions change over time. So we always have to be mindful of that and you know, really just learn, ask, if somebody, here's an example. Somebody said, "Oh, uh, Canada, its lands," um, and he had said, "Oh, the First Nations take care of it. And we enjoy the bounty." I was like, "Oh goodness, somebody better speak to the speechwriter on that one." So it's the language that we use can be very outdated to where we are now, and I think we, as people, we have moved ahead, but sometimes our vernacular hasn't. And that's where a lot of the microaggressions come from, that it's the meaning of it now. In terms of unconscious biases, um, I think people just need to be calling people out and do so without fear, because you're speaking truth. And when you do that, then suddenly it also addresses your microaggressions issue, and suddenly this person has to clue in and go like, oh, and if they meant it, then if they don't fix that, if they don't want to correct that, well, I guess they knew that to begin with.
Great, thank you, Dylan. And I see that our colleagues have put the spotlight on. We're going to turn to Elder Verna in just a couple of moments. But before doing so, I do want to give both Michael and Ileana the opportunity from their perspective to be able to give their inputs in terms of microaggression. So Michael, maybe briefly, and then we'll just turn to Ileana.
I'll try to be really quick. I think the biggest bias that we need to come to is that there is not one truth and there's not one superior knowledge. I think we are predominantly in kind of a Western knowledge system where we kind of view like scientific knowledge, academic knowledge as being superior. And I think people don't need to understand our traditional knowledge. They don't need to understand anything, but they need to give it respect and also give appreciation that it's legitimate, it's equal, it's just different. And so I think if we could get people to do that, that will be huge. On a practical one, I just want to come back to this because I forgot to say is that the the government has introduced. I know Dylan had mentioned policies, or we shouldn't have policies be driving stuff, but there has been a positive policy. There's a policy where the government is actually giving leave for traditional cultural practices. And this is a place where we can actually see, ask managers to just take the leap of faith and say that they don't need to understand why going on the land is therapeutic. They don't need to understand why fishing is so important. They don't need to understand why hunting is so important. All they need to do is say is, we got you. This is your time. No question asked. Hope you have a wonderful time out there and look forward to hearing about it when you get back. If we can have people with that attitude, they don't need to understand whether that knowledge is good. They don't need to understand why it's medicine. But if they can just be encouraging and supportive for people to take advantage of that wonderful policy change that has been made, that will be super helpful.
Thank you, Michael. Eliana, de votre côté, est-ce qu'il y avait des dernières choses que vous vouliez dire ou répondre concernant le côté de micro-agression?
Je dirais rapidement que souvent, les gens qui viennent de communautés autochtones, qui ont des emplois au fédéral, souvent, ils sont les seuls dans leur communauté à avoir ils ne peuvent pas jaser avec d'autres personnes, avoir des cercles de partage avec d'autres personnes. Si c'est le cas, bien, imaginez que vous marchez dans une forêt, puis qu'il vous arrive toutes sortes d'événements, hein, il y a des choses qui arrivent, puis vous attendiez pas à ça, puis c'est frappant. Ben, qu'est-ce qu'on fait dans ce temps-là? On observe. Puis c'est ce que moi, je recommande beaucoup aux gens. Observez ce qui se passe autour de vous. Réagissez quand c'est le temps de réagir. Ne réagissez pas quand c'est pas le temps de réagir. Puis un truc que je donne beaucoup de plus en plus, qui est très important, c'est quand on va au travail, nous, en tant qu'être humain, on a peut-être 200, en tout cas, on a beaucoup, beaucoup d'émotions. Mais on n'apporte pas nos 200 émotions au travail. On apporte un petit sac avec pas plus que 10 émotions. Donc, vous choisissez les 10 émotions que vous allez apporter avec vous, que ce soit une émotion de bien-être, une émotion de performance ou peu importe laquelle vous choisissez, puis vous travaillez avec ces émotions-là. Puis le reste, mais vous observez. Si cette observation-là vient trop lourde puis que vous en avez trop de ces micro-agressions-là, évidemment, allez chercher de l'aide et du support, mais sinon, ça demeure un endroit de travail, puis vous apprenez, puis vous développez tranquillement.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, colleagues. So with that, why don't we turn to Elder Verna for the closing words?
Oh, miigwech, Lorenzo, and all the panelists. Really, I really enjoyed the discussion and listening in, and it has you thinking too as well. One of the things too as well. One of the things I was going to look into too as well is even, especially in the federal government, you're accommodating the one person, your ADM, your deputy minister, the minister. And sometimes, though, as well, you forget about it, that also to how do you balance that you're accommodating the collective. And I think Dylan raised that as well. So that's awareness. I was at a circle yesterday, too. We closed with a circle. And I was just surprised, too, as well. Not surprised. It was a way of people to release sometimes the pressure that they went through with their training for the past 2 days. So again, that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, even 25 years ago, even 10 years ago. The other part, really quickly too, I was also part of this final consultation. And what I mentioned too as well is sometimes too as well, when you're talking about the science, there's the qualitative, quantitative, and they always focus on the quantitative, the science-based, numbers-based, but you need the qualitative too as well. And again, because it brings different learning, that then it's also backed by the quantitative. And we are more sometimes through the power of story is quantitative. That drives this other research too, and actually brings in change. The other quickly though too as well, with this other researcher from Harvard that I sat with, he said that we're in the age of, first of all, information, but now we're in the age of configuration. That we're bombarded with so much information, so much policy. The people that will move forward is the ones that can configure all that and bring forward also solutions and innovation. So on that note, and also innovation, as I always said to students, comes from spirit. And that's why we say, I send you good prayers and I put my little tobacco down for you, because innovation comes from that, and that comes from also circle, but also then the scientific and your knowledge. So I say, miigwech, onje nigashkitoche mawandosik, onje widokwa kakina pamadza jikdan as well goshe, chimino pamadzu watch, chimino dumta watch, conscious quatnigwe de semen, ke goshich kananoj, guchnigwe de semen, shwen mishnon in abigus, miigwech, yeah, miigwech. Je veux dire c'est en français, merci 4 fois. I say thank you 4 times to honor all of you. And I think you did a wonderful conversation today. Miigwech, everybody.
Merci beaucoup, Elder Verna. Et ceci conclut l'événement d'aujourd'hui. So on behalf of the Canada School of Public Service, I'd like to thank Elder Verna, our distinguished guests, Michael, Dylan, and Ileana, as well as all of you from across the country for being part of today's discussion. J'espère que vous avez apprécié l'événement d'aujourd'hui et que vous en repartirez inspiré. The school has more events and courses to offer, so of course you are encouraged to visit the school's website to keep up to date and to register for all future learning opportunities that are of interest to you. Alors encore une fois, un très gros merci. J'espère que vous allez tous passer une très bonne journée et une excellente fin de semaine. Merci beaucoup.